This is the whole point about being a CISO, is that it's not that, this idea, the magical CISO who comes in and suddenly, uses a magic wand and changes everything.
Yeah.
It's not really the case, because you depend on the people in your organization. SASE gives you a bit of flexibility, but again, you're going to look at it from the perspective of what could you actually risk in that environment, rather than what you do from a core perspective. If you think about most of the breaches, certainly ones that we know about and we understand, a lot of us come down to people operating as they always have, clicking on a link they shouldn't have, downloading something they shouldn't have, all of these things that are very, very basic. Mm-hmm. So that's why I always say to people, do some of the more basic things, make sure that you've updated the password on your router. So it's really about, let's not focusing on the shiny objects, let's think about the basics,
Hi, Kevin. Welcome to Be Fearless podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So we've met, last time we met, we talked about your journey. You've been in cybersecurity for more than 25 years. So you work at Levi's, you worked for GE and JP Morgan. So maybe could you tell us, how did you start this journey in the first place?
So when I started in technology, there was no such thing as cybersecurity per se, not as an industry and not as a career in any case. So I'd left university with a degree in medieval history, and there are only certain paths you could do with that. So in terms of teaching or academics or the rest of that, and I actually ended up doing a stagiaire, as they call it, or a traineeship in the European Commission. And when I was at the European Commission, I started getting involved a little bit in IT. And when I left, I was only there for 6-7 months. And when I left that position, there was a role in what they called Bureau d'assistance technique, so a BAT. So basically a technical assistance bureau. And that one was dealing with education systems across the European Union. And what they needed was to create a database across all of the education systems so that they could equalize the qualifications from schools and universities, etc., mainly on secondary schools. So if you left school in Italy, that you would qualify for university in Ireland, which hadn't been the case before, at least not naturally, right?
Yes.
So from doing that job, I got into creating databases, and actually I got probably the most boring job, which was creating tables by hand in Access 1.0. So you can imagine how old I am.
Not the most exciting one.
Not the most exciting job in the world. So, but for some reason I did quite enjoy it. And I realized at that stage that I really was interested in getting involved in IT. And then, from there, I worked for myself for a while building websites, very basic HTML websites. I mean, nothing compared to what we can do now. But the fact of the matter was, it was a skill set that was in demand. More and more businesses, and certainly more things like embassies and political parties, etc., wanted to create their websites. So without any training, just getting a book. I think it was the first of the dummies books, building websites for dummies. I started creating some of these things and getting into doing some contracting for the European Union. But I realized that I didn't really have the skill set for that, so I needed to go back and learn. So I had a choice then of going back to university or going back to college in computer science, or getting a job that would train me up. And that's how I ended up working for Levi Strauss, because they trained me up on HP UX. There was no Linux at that stage, it was just emerging. But HPX primarily, MPIX, some very old mainframe systems, etc. And I started off working in the computer room, swapping tapes and ripping reports up, financial reports, and putting them into cubby holes, etc. So that was the start of it.
I think it's you brought a very interesting point that back when you started, there was no proper formal education for it, and you were learning as you were growing along your career. Do you think something like this is possible today?
I think you can see that in terms of how people create stuff on TikTok, for example, or the creativity that people have. So I think getting a career in tech is still possible without a formal education, but there are different routes, and it's maybe not the kind of tech that we would use today, right? When people are creating these things, I see it with my own kids in terms of the things that they are doing in, making music, or just generally working on different programs or doing mods on games, etc. So there are still routes in that don't require a formal education and a formal route. So I do think it is possible, absolutely. But I think that it was probably a little easier in the 90s because, as I said, there were a lot of skill sets that just they were not in universities. If you did computer science, you were doing it at a very different kind of level. You weren't necessarily learning coding. You weren't necessarily learning the things and the building blocks of creating websites, etc. Now, that quickly came, and there were courses that are offered very, very soon in those areas. But in the beginning, I think it took a while for those traditional kind of approaches to computer science to actually be removed, I'd say, right? And so, I find that, at that stage in the 90s, leading up to kind of that web explosion, and then what they call Web 2.0, et cetera, that happened, in the early 2000s, it was a period where people really could just be creative, and if you were creative enough, you could build a career out of it.
I think it's still the case. It's just different generation. You started with for Book for Dummies, and right now it's just people watching TikTok.
Yes.
On just getting education online, but using different channels for it.
Yes.
But I think, once you're already there in the cybersecurity space, there was still quite a huge leap from being a practitioner and just becoming a leader.
Yes.
So when do you think it exactly happened?
I think when you start moving into leadership roles, I mean, I'll be quite honest, as a technologist, as somebody who was coding and writing code, etc., there was definitely a point where, there were people much more talented than me. I could say that for sure, right? I think that essentially, one of the things that I'm good at is organizations and organizational structures. And no matter how you think about technology, it requires people to put it in place. Right. So if you think about the traditional word that we talk about, cybersecurity or IT in general, we talk about a people, process, technology,
Yes.
And for me, I think the people and the process side is something that is one of my areas of strength. And I think that for CISOs, that's kind of one of the areas that is an area they should be looking at as a strength, because, recognizing the talent around you and who's good and who's bad is extremely important. So for me, it was really getting more involved in projects. So there was a moment where HP and Compaq, when I was working at HP at the time, they merged. And when they merged, we took on a managed service business, or a service delivery business, rather. And in that kind of service delivery business, it was companies where we talked about, flipping the badge. So basically, an IT department would be outsourced. And rather than, people being let go, they would say, now you work for HP. So you used to work for Ericsson, or you used to work for Siemens, or you used to work forever. But now your company's HP, so you're an outsourced person, right?
Yeah.
Which came as a bit of a shock to the people, suddenly working in one day and being an employee and then being an outsourced person. And in those situations that involved making those people or creating those groups and those teams and turning them into a HP team or into whatever the company was, turning them into that team. And I think that that's something I didn't know I was good at until I started doing it, right? And once I was able to start doing it, I realized that's, functionally just getting an organization pointed in the right direction with everybody working together. That's essentially where it started. And that's what most leadership is about, really.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of people forget. They focus on hard skills so much that forget that there are so many soft skills that help you grow into becoming a leader in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe one of the interesting questions would be to find out, you had such a long CISO career. What would you say was your proudest moment?
Well, that's a hard one, I have to say, because there's been so many events, and not all of them have been done, when I was a CISO. I think for me, I couldn't be prouder of the teams I've worked with, to be honest, right? I think that if I think about all the teams and all the people that I've worked with in the past, and the things that any successes that I've said, okay, that's something I can put my hand on and say, I did that, that was my success, really dependent on other people, right? And this is the whole point about being a CISO, is that it's not that, this idea, the magical CISO who comes in and suddenly, uses a magic wand and changes everything. It's not really the case, because you depend on the people in your organization, right? And once they row in and once they create something, then you could say, well, that's the team that built it, So in that regards, I do have some proudest moments in terms of being able to turn teams around that were failing in the past, that had, missing SLAs, etc. And then being able to come in and turn it around and change the attitude, change the approach, link the processes and the technology to, risk-based outcomes for the customer. And then through that, being able to turn things around. So one example would be a company I worked for at the time, and I don't want to name too many because some of them are too recent, so I don't want to get too close into it. But a few years ago, where I came in and turned the team around, so that over the 18 months that I was there, I was able to provide a service that didn't have a single missed SLA for those 18 months, right? Oh, wow. Which is a very kind of, say, small technical kind of thing for people who don't understand service level agreements and service delivery. But for service delivery, that's quite incredible. So and again, was it down to me? Well, certainly I think I created the structures to make it happen, but it's the team that actually did it. So it's something that you have to be really aware of, I think.
I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg case in a way. Did you have such an amazing team that helped you to grow so much, or was it you that influenced the team? I feel like it reinforces themselves.
So I think one thing that I'm good at is being a catalyst, right? So I think that there are skills people have, and I think if you're really going to bring the best out of people, you have to be a good communicator. You have to be very clear on what outcomes are. Also, not it works in the same way. Right. So you have to understand what makes people tick and understand how to approach them. Some people need very strict a set of tasks, very, very clear outcomes, etc., and really need their hand held almost the whole way through a process. Where other people, you simply say, that's the outcome I want, and they go off and do it, right? And if you're going to be outcome based, which I am, I'm only worried about what the end result is. I'm not concerned with how people get to that end result, right? Unless it's something that's a regulatory environment, which is something different. But if it's just the outcome you're looking for, then you just have to let people do it in their own way if you can. But you have to recognize the people that need help and the people that can do it on their own. And it's not something that, comes naturally necessarily for me as a leader. It's something I've learned, right? And there's plenty of mistakes, say my biggest, successes or whatever, or achievements that I'm the most proud of. There's plenty of things that I've learned from mistakes in terms of, the mistakes I've made in terms of organizationally or technology choices or what have you. So there's plenty in my background that's also, failure. But I think some of those things are the things that teach you the most,
Right. I think you touched upon an interesting point. Let's say when it comes to a regulatory environment, and you worked for such a large financial institution as JP Morgan, and I think it would be interesting to know what are some of the biggest cyber risks that you encountered in that specific space?
What's interesting is that every industry that you work in has its own nuance in terms of areas that they're most concerned with. So we talk about the CIA of security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and all three of them are you would say equally important, but one is more important than the other. And if you think about what's required in certain situations, not all. People say banking; it's a very wide term. Not everything is the same within banking. You have people who are banking in the purest form, let's say retail and bricks and mortar type of high street banks, giving out mortgages, that kind of thing. And then you have banks that are assisting investment, corporate investment. Then you have private banking, etc. Then you have trading. You have there's all forms of these kind of financial instruments that you have to manage. So if you look at that, and then you look at something like pharma, for pharma, it's especially in the drug trial field that I was working in at the time when I was working for Quintiles, their main concern is the integrity of data. So for a study that if you do a drug trial, that nobody can manipulate the data or change the data, etc. So from start to finish, and you can demonstrate that to the regulator. If you look at banking, a lot of what banking is about and what they're focused in is availability. So if I'm doing payments, is my payment going to go through on time? Is it going to arrive on the day that I said it was going to arrive? If it fails or it's stopped, people don't get paid. They don't get their wages, don't get their mortgages, etc. Availability also in terms of trading, some of it is very low latency, so I need to do a high speed trade because I'm looking at something that that in milliseconds it can make a difference in terms of getting a particular price on a particular asset.
It seems like there is just a different focus when it comes to value chain. As you mentioned, farmers, this is the beginning of the process when they develop the product, and when it comes to financial services, this is where as the process are ongoing, like as you said, transactions. But in general, I would say out of all industries, financial services is such a heavily protected. Sometimes you compare it to defense ministries.
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, they have the resources, right?
Yes,
So the larger financial organizations have the resources. They can put a lot of people, they can put a lot of technology, a lot of money behind it. And because of that, you find that often they are set up in a very specific way where you have access to threat intelligence, you have access to R&D, you have all of the tools at your disposal that other industries possibly don't, mainly because they don't have the budget to put into IT in general and specifically into cyber.
But at the same time, what kept you awake at night whenever you thought of the risk that you were facing back then?
Well, I'm working for a financial institution with all of those resources. I actually slept quite well, to be perfectly honest. Anyway, so I've heard that before. What keeps you awake at night? As a CISO. I mean, if you were going to be, I'd say, led by anxiety and worry in terms of how you're set up, then you're probably not organizing yourself properly, right? Both in terms of your own emotional identity, but also in terms of how you organize the workplace. So for me, obviously, there are areas of concern. I mean, I think if you think of ransomware, denial of service, again, thinking about that availability aspect, right? So those kinds of things would be the things I'd be most worried about, that if there was something that happened that affected the availability of services, that would then have a knock-on effect into things like the payments business or into trading or something like that. That would be of major concern. So the things that would be most focused on would be those. That's, again, to be really clear, obviously confidentiality and integrity of data, etc., is extremely important in the financial area, right? But if I was going to say the thing that that most bankers would say is that I'll deal with a confidentiality breach, that's a problem, it's an issue, mainly to deal with regulators, etc., and it's a concern for our customers. But if my payments are going through fine and my traders are able to operate securely, that's really what my main focus is going to be.
Yeah, you can always break it down into some issues that are more important, like ransomware, but then confidentiality issues is still a big concern in a way. Even though it feels like something that's small, at the end of the day it can expand to extent that it becomes a serious issue, especially once AI is out. I think financial services might be using it a lot, for example, to summarize some data, and there might be cases when, let's say, analyst takes important report, inserts into ChatGPT and asks to summarize it. I think that can be one of the big concerns.
Yes, well, that's what I was going to say. So certainly not OpenAI, so nothing ChatGPT and all of that. Okay. Absolutely, all the banking institutions have banned that, right? So that's not something that they would use internally. Most companies, in a way, should be very wary of how they use something like ChatGPT in their environments. The thing that a lot of the large financial organizations have is that they have the resources to build their own AI models, right? So I think that's where the interesting part is. So in that kind of generative AI, which is kind of, if you think of from a cloud perspective, or if you're looking for that from as an analogy, it'd be the difference between being on-prem or in public cloud, right? So we're talking about kind of on-prem AI. That's certainly something that banking institutions are already using and already looking at.
I think it's amazing. As you said, having these resources really allows you to have something on-prem. But at the same time, my worry would be, how do you prevent your employees not going home and then doing the same thing on their own ChatGPT?
Well, I mean, most banks, most institutions, and in fact, this is true almost everywhere I worked in terms of how things were developing, will have DLP processes in place and technology in place to stop people from cutting and pasting when they're at work, etc. Is there a certain degree of it where it'll happen? Sure. I mean, there's bound to be a certain amount, but I think that if you have the right technologies and the processes in place, you can stop the majority of it. And I think it's really, I think that's one thing to remember about all of the vulnerabilities that we face, from cybersecurity, is that cyber is something where you're kind of piling one problem on top of another. Yes. You're not necessarily fixing a problem and then moving on to the next one, right? Yes. So sometimes the technology kind of supersedes some of the threats, but you'll find somewhere in the world somebody's still using some legacy system somewhere that has all of those old vulnerabilities, right? So it's always an issue. Like when we talk about it in cyber conferences, etc., we don't talk about a new threat somehow superseding an old threat. We say that was the old threat, but now there's a new one to add to the pile, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's something to bear in mind when we're talking about cyber and issues along those lines. It's essentially about that ever increasing number of threats that we have to deal with, never really being able to fix a specific one unless the technology completely moves on.
Exactly. I mean, you can never promise 100% protection with whichever technology there is out there.
The first virus, the first worm that was ever produced and ever distributed was distributed through email. What's our biggest risk and biggest vector? It's email, right? So the fact that unless we stop using email and start using something else that's entirely secure, now people use chat and all of those things now as well, but they have their own issues. The traditional mode of communication still has the same traditional vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think you touched upon a good point when it comes to email. There are so many sophisticated attacks out there.
Yeah.
Phishing is on the next level. They might be able to read the whole email thread and then customize message to such an extent that you can do nothing about it.
Well, I mean, the thing is about AI is that AI is pretty good at finding AI, right? So, I mean, if you have AI models, it's certainly true that, with ChatGPT, etc., if you think about, well-crafted phishing emails, before traditionally, you'd always find something, and now it might be an email address itself, but even some of the very best, you'll find something that would be off, there's some area in terms of the language or something that isn't quite right, and some of them are very sophisticated, so it took a lot of effort to get to that point without any assistance, right? But having said that, with AI modeling, people can create these incredible phishing emails that look absolutely perfect. And to your point, they can take emails and follow the same grammar, make the same mistakes as somebody makes, and they make it look exactly the same. However, that if you have AI tools that read that email, they can also recognize where an AI has been involved. So I think it's really about. I hate to say arms race because I hate this kind of weaponization of language, right? Because I think we have enough war and destruction in the world right now. We don't need to weaponize language, but it is kind of an arms race. In fairness, so it is about trying to match that. I think AI is one of the areas that, for me, most concerns me is that the regulations around AI are very lax. Nobody really knows how to regulate it, how to manage it, and what the boundaries are. So a lot of it is self-regulated. Now, that's good and bad in terms of how the cyber industry can respond to things like AI. But I think it's something that we really need to look at just from a kind of an ethical perspective, that we look at it and say, how are we going to manage AI into the future?
Right. AI is quite, it can be a virtue and a curse at the same time. As you said, it can help, but then it also can destroy the systems. So this is, as you say, I think as more regulations come into place, you would understand better which side has more weight. You
mean in terms of the adversary?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. The one thing you have to remember about we say there's many terms for it, the adversary, the threat actors, they've become quite industrialized in their approach. So they operate very much as if they were properly incorporated companies, etc. The one difference being they have no regulator. They have no regulations, they have no laws that they're concerned with. They operate completely unbound. So they have no constraints in terms of how they develop their attacks and how they work through those areas. Whereas if you're defending yourself, you have some constraints in terms of how you can actually manage that risk, right? Because there used to be this thing saying you could be offensive, and that if somebody's attacking you, attack them back, etc. I have no doubt that happens, particularly in a military context. But officially, and certainly in terms of all the companies I've worked for, it's always on defense. So if you're always on defense and you're never really attacking, and you're constrained by regulators in terms of how you manage your technology, how you manage the behavior of your people, etc., then you're not really on a level playing field with the people who have no constraints, right? So imagine like if you were playing a rugby game or a soccer game and you were following the rules, but the other team wasn't following the rules at all, and they were picking the ball up and throwing it into the net, right? So that's but there was the referee could do nothing about it. That's kind of where we're at, when it comes to dealing with it, and which is concerning, obviously. But I think, as an industry, it's something that the cybersecurity industry has been dealing with for many, many years and is getting better at in terms of that kind of overall defense.
I think there are so many important issues that you touched upon, and as you worked in many different industries within cybersecurity for more than 25 years, do you think, like in general, how do you think the CISO role involved to deal with all these issues?
So I think that, and it kind of comes back to the starting point of the question, or of our conversation, that the CISO at the beginning was really kind of seen as just like a master technologist, like looking after cyber technology, often reporting into a CIO and as an IT function. But the thing is that, as our use of technology has evolved, it's become something a lot broader than that. And I think the CISO now is really more of a risk advisor and a risk professional than a technologist. I think there's where the focus should be is in those areas, right? So the CISO really is somebody that should be speaking to the business and be seen as part of the business leadership. And essentially saying, if you're deciding as a business to go in a certain direction or make an investment, that you're there to do that due diligence and to make sure that, first of all, following regulatory requirements, but also looking at it from a risk perspective and saying, are you managing the risk correctly? And these are the things you need to think about, and the vulnerabilities and the things you're exposing yourself to with this new technology. So I think essentially it's moved away from being that pure technologist into something a lot wider, which is somebody who can really work across all of the areas of risk and compliance and technology and all of those kind of areas, right? So it's extremely broad now compared to being a very narrow function. And where I've seen like CISOs fail and companies fail is when they have somebody who's too much on the technology side and everything is about how's the SOC being run and what antivirus have we chosen, what have we done. Now those are essential things, but I would think of it as a pillar. And this is why the CISO is the Chief Information Security Officer, not the Chief Cyber Officer, right? So cybersecurity is a tool in terms of protecting information, right? So this is the really, I'd say that's the development that I've seen in terms of the role of the CISO. And that's why when you look at it, the CISO sometimes is not a technologist, it's just somebody who has that, the balance has been, I'm there to speak to the business. Sometimes that can be taken too far. I mean, the CISO needs to have a grounding in technology, needs to understand the technology, needs to understand the cyber risk and understand and help to make those technology choices. You can't just wash your hands of it and, trust somebody else. The buck stops with you as the CISO. So it's an essential part of your armory, but the rest of it is equally important, and that comes down to your regulatory compliance, your risk view, all of those types of things are part of how you operate, and I think that's how the CISO has evolved. So the CISO, I think, shouldn't be seen as kind of a junior C-suite person. It should be right with the C-suite and talking directly sometimes to the chief risk officer or to the CEO rather than to the CIO. So it's really something that should be reporting that information right to the board, right? Without a filter, and that's how I think it's evolving.
I think today, luckily, we're in such an era where cybersecurity risk is being more and more recognized. It was recognized by Economic Forum as one of the biggest threats out there, and I think it actually allows CISOs to have this access to C-level team. So overall, luckily, this is growing and this is getting better, giving more exposure to CISOs and giving a war.
Well, it's kind of seen as one of the number one issues with boards, but you still find often that the CISO is reporting into the CIO, who reports into not necessarily even into the CEO, but into an operating officer and then into CEO. So it's kind of layered. And you see that in a lot of industries. Not every company operates that way, and often there are dotted lines and there's other approaches and other ways to bring it. But I think this is, in my mind, it's just my opinion, I think it's a mistake. I think that really the CISO should be broken out of the technology pillar and seen as something slightly separate, because otherwise you end up in a situation where the budget for your cybersecurity is often seen as an offset of the technology budget, right?
Yes.
And the overall IT budget, how much am I going to give to cyber? And
it's a conflict of interest.
Well, the average is less than 8%, right? So 8% of your IT budget goes towards cybersecurity. That's what most companies operate on, right? Now, it's very different. You talk about financial institutions, of course. I'm not talking about any of those. They invest so much in it, and we already talked about that, the level that they're at. But your average company operating in a variety of industries will generally spend no more than 8% of their budget on cybersecurity, and that's a standard, right?
Yeah.
Which is, in a way, to me, probably not enough. However, it's you have to cut your cloth according to your measure, right? So it has to be what you're able to afford. So that's an important part of the consideration. So I completely understand that. Those are the constraints that you have. But I think that if you're in that situation, then you have the relationship between a CISO and a CIO. There's a bit of a conflict of interest, right? Because the CIO is depending on, I do have to deliver this within a budget. I have a CISO who's going to take away so much of my budget, so I can't do other things because of this risk that may or may not happen, right? So it becomes a little bit of a difficult conversation. Whereas if cyber is on its own separate area and its own separate budget, it's really a conversation between the board and the business directly about what the budget should be for cyber, and not seen as being just an offshoot of the technology budget. So that's again my opinion.
Right.
I'm not saying that that's a golden rule.
No, it's something to strive for. I think it's right to give a word to CISOs, because this is such a bigger threat that today we cannot just overlook it and let the organizational structure harm the overall performance of a company when it comes to cybersecurity. So this is definitely consideration.
I think so. I think one of the things, if you go back over the 25 years, so when I started, people had a mobile phone, right? But it wasn't, you could just make calls and send texts on it, right? And there's a certain amount of phone hacking and stuff you could do with it, of course, right? But generally, people went to work, they sat down at a computer, right? Which was kind of an explosion in the 90s. Even in the 80s, a lot of people went to work and they didn't have a computer on their desk, And then suddenly in the 90s, everybody had a computer on their desk, right? So you go in and you work on the computer, and then the internet came in, but everything was locked into the office. Then you got up from your desk and you went home, right? And you didn't have a laptop, you didn't have access into the office. Everything was kind of confined to that one area, right? Now we have this kind of pervasive connection, straight to the office, straight to home, straight to my bank, straight to the web, straight to,
everything is interconnected.
Everything is on all the time. So in that context, cyber has become something that you could really confine to a moment and to a place. It's just something that is absolutely around us at all times and touches on our personal life as much as it touches on our work life. So if you talk about how businesses should operate and how should manage things, they have to understand that, more than likely their networks are already breached in some form, right? Mainly because of the way people operate and live their daily lives, right? It has nothing to do with, how can I set my perimeter if I'm allowing people to connect in from home and on their mobile devices, etc. How can I ensure that every single connection and every part of my perimeter is secured? And as that becomes harder and harder, that's when you start moving into things like zero trust and looking at it. We used to call it defense in depth, but now it's zero trust. But you look at it in that perspective, and you're looking and saying, how do I manage on a per host, per workstation, per phone basis to ensure that I'm really protecting my environment, So it becomes, so this is why it's something that I think businesses need to wake up to, the fact that, might be working or managing a manufacturing plant, and you say, well, I don't need cybersecurity, but all of your people are connecting into your network from home on their mobile devices. The possibilities of disruption are enormous.
Yeah, I think it's a great conclusion to the overall, no matter which industry where you work on. At the end of the day, you should understand how interconnected each industry is, and you cannot really disregard cybersecurity. Well, it was nice having you here, Kevin. Thank you so much for our chat, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Be Fearless podcast, Kevin.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
You talked about some of the key cybersecurity risks and trends that CISOs face in the financial sector earlier. Now, banks, as we know, have one of the most robust cybersecurity systems out there, but it doesn't remove the fact that, like any other organization, banks still need to work with external parties who may not have the same level of resources or awareness towards security. How do banks typically think about third-party risks?
So it's become more and more an issue over the last few years. So, I mean, I think the classic example would be SolarWinds, right, from a couple of years ago. And that kind of woke up, it's something that, banks and financial institutions, other industries have been concerned about for many years, So, and I think in terms of how it's viewed is, it's very necessary to work with third parties. And third parties can be a customer, they can be a provider, or they can be somebody that is providing a service on your behalf, right? So if you're thinking about the last mile technologies that are used when they're kind of linking into payment systems that are managing payments worldwide, et cetera, for a specific financial institution. So obviously, it's been a concern, and I think regulators, certainly here in APAC, have started to wake up to this, and certainly we've seen in Australia with CPS 234, where they started looking specifically on the requirements for you as a business to assure yourself that your providers have cybersecurity controls in place to manage it, and that you have controls for your customers as well. So in actual fact, when we start talking about third parties, we're almost in a way thinking about fourth and fifth parties as well, right? So this is really kind of where it's kind of extended from. And I think that in terms of how you manage those kind of vendor relationships, understanding how people are connecting into your network, first of all, understanding exactly what the requirements are for the software, the applications that they're using, if they're using those kind of applications. And, those are fundamental. And I think that in terms of managing those connections, first of all, that's really the first, from a strategic perspective, that's the first thing that you should be looking at. Then beyond that, we should be looking for more than just a paper assurance of cyber resiliency and cyber readiness. Right, so it's more about having the right to audit, the ability to audit, and to ensure that you enact that at a given moment to know that exactly how your third parties are set up and what the expectations are. So it's coming on a few different levels. So first of all, people are rethinking in terms of how they allow third parties to connect into their networks. The regulator is looking at it from an accountability perspective and saying, in terms of those third parties, what your responsibilities are. Because one thing to remember is that, you can't, if something fails in your environment, but it's the fault of a third party, you can't go to the regulator and say, well, it's all their fault. It's nothing to do with me, right? Then the regulator's not going to listen to that. They're going to say, yeah, but you're the accountable one because you're the one providing the service or the product or whatever. So that means that the accountability has moved on to you to make sure that your third parties are properly secured. And I think that's the kind of developing trend that we're seeing in terms of third party connections into your network.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting topic because it's always a big debate on where does your responsibility stop, right? To your point, a lot of these third-party vendors also have their third-party vendors, and how much diligence can you do as a bank or as an organization? When it comes to web-based threats, many companies use proxy-based solutions like SASE and SSEs. We saw that you work both on the vendor side and as a CISO, you must have encountered many of these tools as well. What are your thoughts on these solutions?
The thing about SASE in general and basically edge products in terms of perimeter edge products that people can access, it's an availability issue. So in terms of people being able to operate from home or anywhere on the road and to be able to access certain products from the network, without having to go through a VPN or log in, etc. So those are the kind of capabilities that are provided. And I think that for certain parts of your organization, it's brilliant, so your productivity. So thinking of email or, Word documents or things like that you might need to access, when you're on the road, when you're meeting customers or when you're at home and you want to do something very quickly. So I think that kind of approach is something that's been a godsend, I think, to organizations. It's much easier to organize, much easier to manage. And those SASE products are very secure, and it essentially gives you the same kind of protection that you would get from a VPN. In terms of, if you're looking on your mobile phone, you have a sandbox, and within that sandbox, you have your SASE products and you can access them, etc. Now, having said that, that's fine for parts of your organization, but not necessarily your core crown jewel applications that I would say are directly linked into your business capability, right? You could argue in some ways that email, etc., is part of that. It depends on your business, but in general, that's the type of thing that you wouldn't allow to be on an edge or a SASE provided service. So when it comes to that, and in terms of the use of proxies, then for proxies, in some ways, absolute godsend, because you can manage your traffic, you can whitelist websites, you can do all of that type of stuff. You can pile a lot of cybersecurity tools onto your proxies, etc. But you also find it that how many proxies are you going to have? How many gateways are you going to have across the world? And for certain products, you may only have, or certain applications, you may only have one that's going to manage your whole business globally. So there's a bit of a concentration risk there. I think it's not generally something that is, I'd say, very agile in terms of managing risk. It's a very stationary kind of static approach to managing cybersecurity when you're looking at proxies. SASE gives you a bit of flexibility, but again, you're going to look at it from the perspective of what could you actually risk in that environment rather than what you do from a core perspective.
Yeah, I think in terms of concentration risk, another category of tools that many people are concerned about now is single sign-on, right? Because you have that single point of failure, and it's being used by some of the most robust organizations out there. Yes. How do you think about de-risking this sort of tools?
In terms of single sign-on, it kind of depends on what your requirements are, right? Because I think if you think about highly regulated, highly managed environments, you think of a single sign-on, it's hard to implement because the regulator may have said we need to show that you have controls in place per access, per person, and show these role-based access on an ongoing basis. And then you're managing a lot of these connections through entitlements, right? And the entitlements in terms of whether it's access to the application itself or what type of access to have within the application itself. And as you start working through that environment, either leveraging AD or other tools, you're getting to a point of ever-increasing complexity. And I think that while the user is feeling, well, my single sign-on is simple, like sign on and now I can operate within that term, the complexity behind the scenes just increases because of some of these regulated environments where you have to show, exactly the route that people took in terms of those connections, etc. So I think that, in terms of managing that, probably pushing things more towards web-based solutions, more towards the browser. So when I'm doing a single sign-on, the browser isn't just like a front end and I'm going into some kind of client necessarily, but I'm doing something that's session-based, etc. So I think it's generally about looking at it from the perspective of a session-based connection that you can manage, and you can look at the times that people are connected for, and that you can actually stop. So you stop persistent connections across a single sign-on. But that would be one approach, I think.
No, that's an interesting approach. And I love something you discussed with Shasha earlier, which is we're up against these people who basically have no constraints, right? They're not constrained by regulators. They're not constrained by, the classical rules that organizations are bound to. What are some of the most creative or crazy attacks that you've come across?
It's funny. I mean, I think a lot of the attacks that are most successful, that hit the headlines, often you're not sure exactly how they manage it, right? So if you think of the attack on Sony, right? People have lots of theories about it, but nobody's really been able to explain exactly what happened, right? If you think about the attack on, I think it was on TV5 in France, where it seemed like there was a phishing attack, and somebody clicked on the wrong link, and then over a period of months gave access into the environment where it took that long for people to find they moved laterally within the organization, and it took them that long to find an administrator account that they could then leverage to bring out the kind of outage on the TV, etc. So when you talk about creativity in attacks, I think that there's a lot of creativity in terms of how people are attacking, but I think the ones that we know the most about are probably the least creative, if I could put it in those terms, right? For me, some of the things that I've seen captured have been, kind of very simple in terms of, embedded code within documents where essentially people have used very, very tiny font. So it's barely detectable. Like if you printed the page, you wouldn't even see it. If you were reading the page on screen, you'd have to blow it up by X amount. So I think some of these kind of inserted attacks within pictures, etc., between images, JPEG, whatever, which we can now catch through steganography and the rest, those have been extremely creative. So, but I think generally, if you think about most of the breaches, certainly ones that we know about and we understand, a lot of us come down to people operating as they always have, clicking on a link they shouldn't have, downloading something they shouldn't have, accessing something from home on a compromised home computer, not updating their router at home, all of these things that are very, very basic. So I think that what you find is that while there are lots of sophisticated attackers out there, for the most part, they're just trying to flood the zone and understand that, often it's almost by accident that they've penetrated your environment. It's just that they've sent out so many phishing emails. Somebody somewhere is going to click on something. And often you find that, people will get access into a network and not sure what to do with it. And this is why we talk about, persistent threat and people sitting on a network or accessing a network and doing nothing with it for months or years even, and then suddenly deciding what to do. Often it's because they're not even sure what they have or where they are, or what they need or what they can get, because it's all opportunistic, right? So I think when we talk about creativity, yes, there are creative attacks, of course there are, but honestly, if we were going to worry about something, I would be worried about that flood the zone approach. So that's why I always say to people, do some of the more basic things, make sure that you've updated the password on your router, make sure that you are up to date on your software at home on your laptop or on your phone, install security software on your home computer if you're using it to connect into work, or even if you're not, right? So it's really about, that's not focusing on the shiny objects, let's think about the basics,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, sometimes people do the simplest things, like reuse the same passwords across different pages. And this is absolutely a huge vulnerability issue.
So just on that point, absolutely. Some people, almost everybody does that.
I am guilty as well, to be honest. Kevin, I'd love to talk about, what's next for you.
Sure.
You mentioned before that you are perhaps considering doing a fractional CISO role. For our listeners out there who might not be as familiar with the role, could you share a bit more about what fractional CISOs do?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I'm getting to the stage in my career and I'm looking at it from, as an option, I've worked with a lot of very big enterprises, and the one thing that I've discovered, working in those places is that, affecting change is a huge effort, right? And adding the value you'd like to add takes a long time, right? And I think that if you look at the ever-increasing threats that people have, and we talked earlier about the budgets that people have in terms of what they can put into cybersecurity and what they can't. I think that I'm very interested in working in a space where I can help smaller companies and more medium enterprises in terms of affecting proper cyber controls and protecting their environments. And obviously to do that in a way that is cost effective, but also means that people get the benefit of my experience and my background and the work that I've done in the past. So that's why I've started looking into areas like fractional CISO is one way to look at it. There's also CISO as a service, etc. Yeah. So and there's now a plethora of them. So it's a very very kind of busy environment, right? As people trying to find exact ways to hone in on what's right and what's wrong in that space, right? Now, what is a fractional CISO and what is a CISO as a service and what should you expect from it, right? So these are the kind of things that I think are just emerging. I mean, it's been around for a couple of years, maybe a little bit longer, but it's really started to become, I think people are looking at it more and more because, you have companies that are saying, well, it's all great for Kevin to get onto a podcast and say that we're not spending enough in cybersecurity, but, I only make, X amount a year. I can only put this much into, protecting my environment and then developing my product, etc. And we need to make money to pay my employees and pay myself. So how do we go about that? And I think people should be looking at it from the perspective and saying that if you're a large enough organization, but I'm talking, 700 to a couple of thousand employees, and we've got a market cap of a few hundred million or whatever, you need to hire a cybersecurity person, right? You need to hire a CISO, right, to manage that. Even if that CISO doesn't have a massive team and you're doing managed services, you need somebody, as I said, to be that kind of business link, for the rest of it. But if you're a startup, for example, or a smaller organization with fewer resources, how do you go about that and what you should be looking at? And I think it really depends on what stage you're at and what environment you're in and what industry you're in terms of how you approach it. And I think that this fractional CISO role can apply across a lot of different areas, but I think really kind of, late stage startups, companies that are just about to go IPO or are looking for an acquisition, they get to that point and then they realize, well, the questions start coming in terms of how have you regulated your environment, how you manage cybersecurity, how are you looking at the cyber protection of your tools, etc. How have you managed your app development, right? Have you looked at it from secure code, from the start, or are you trying to retroactively look at it, or are you looking at it at all? And I think that's the kind of thing where, a CISO can come in and give either part of the time or for a fixed amount of time can do a review and come back and give recommendations to the company and saying, look, you need to start looking at your risk in this way. You need to start investing in this technology. You need to think about a managed service. These are the kind of things that you really need a CISO to look at in the whole, rather than saying, oh, I'm going to get some cyber person to come in and they'll go in and look at it and say, oh, you need, this antivirus or that technology part, because it doesn't necessarily meet the regulatory requirements, right? Which is what a CISO brings you.
Yeah. I suspect that one of the questions that many companies would have is, look, I already have external advisors like cybersecurity consultants or value-added resellers. When do you think companies should think about, okay, I actually need a dedicated fractional CISO for this?
Because it can be an ongoing relationship, right? So it's there for the long haul in terms of your environment, in terms of your company. So if you bring in a consultant, they will come in and they'll consult, right? They'll say and give you some advice. The point about a CISO is that a CISO has to be vested in the outcome. A consultant is not vested in the outcome. A consultant comes in and gives you advice and says, you should be doing this. They give you advice and they say, okay, there's my professional fee, thank you. And then they go to the next job. And they leave you sitting there holding the can going, okay, well now I have to, what do I do next, right? So then it's more, well, do I get that consultant back in or do I hire somebody or whatever, And then you're looking at in terms of how much budget do I have to put towards this, even though I need somebody to be vested in this environment. So I think you look at it you shouldn't be looking at it from a fractional CISO perspective into just one person necessarily, except for that person decides on the balance of work within the practice, right? So essentially you're looking at somebody who can give up some of their particular time or has a practice where you're dealt with as one of the customers on an ongoing basis.
Got it. And for companies that are looking for fractional CISOs, what are the one or two things that you recommend them look out for?
So I think, again, be careful of that kind of consultant approach, right? Which is nothing against consultants, by the way. Consultants are absolutely, I was a consultant myself and, I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll be doing consultancy in the future again. The point is, though, that's the role of the consultant, right? Is to kind of design something, give advice, whatever, and then move on to the next project and move to the next thing, right? Whereas what you want is somebody whose relationship is ongoing and can build up over a number of years without adding a huge amount of cost into your environment, right? So it's an advisory role to a certain degree. You could also look at it in terms of, people creating that link to managed services as well and remaining within the group and understanding what's appropriate for that organization. So a fractional CISO is independent or should be independent of technology. So they shouldn't be coming in and saying, you need to use this product over that product, but they should be coming in and saying, here's the range of products, here's the costs associated with them, here's the benefits, pros and cons of each in your environment, and what you would want to do. I would recommend this because of the outcome that it produces, rather than saying because it's on the right part of the Gartner quadrant, or it's like the market leader, or they're paying me some money that you don't know about, right? So it's really not about that. It's really about saying my recommendations are independent and they're for you. So you're kind of you're bringing them into your organization, in a way. Yeah.
No, I think this point of independence is absolutely critical. Hopefully, having an external fractional CISO that may not directly sit below the CTO or report into the CIO will absolve some of that conflict of interest that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think organizationally, it's that CISO is somebody that should be reporting into the business, right? And I think that's the big gap I see in a lot of industries and a lot of companies, is that the CISO is kind of wheeled out once a quarter or every couple of quarters, whatever, to update the board on cyber, and they get 15 minutes and they do a quick thing on their, and then they go, right? And that always surprises me, because I think that, if cyber is really the most important thing on everybody's mind, how come you only get 15 minutes once a quarter to update the board, right? They really should be asking questions about that. Whereas I think that if you have a fractional CISO that's more of a board advisor in that sense, then I think that it can be good. Now, there are plenty of advisors or security advisors that come into board settings, etc. I'm not talking about necessarily that type of advisory, because when you get to that type of advisory, it's more kind of a trends and it's more general. We're talking about somebody who's really rolling up their sleeves and is part of the organization, in essence.
Yeah, and looking a bit into the future, for companies that already have a fractional CISO, when should they think about transitioning into a full-time CISO? And
I think it's growth. It's growth because here we're talking. As I said, we're talking about startups. I've heard this phrase before, scrappy startups. They're always going to be a little bit messy. They're going to be a bit over here, and, they're working on. That's absolutely understandable. But, a startup that's kind of late stage has customers, right? And the reasons that they're going for an IPO, for an acquisition, is because they actually have customers who are using their product actively, right? They will be expecting and assuming that cybersecurity is being dealt with properly. It doesn't matter what the tool is. It doesn't have to be a cybersecurity tool. It doesn't have to be anything in that realm. It could be, a fintech product, or it could be some other application or something else in some other industry that's very specific to it. But the customers should expect that those tools are cyber ready and cyber protected, and that they're looked at it strategically, which is what a fractional CISO can bring.
Awesome. Kevin, we've now arrived at the fun part of the show.
Okay, good.
So it's
been all fun so far.
Yeah, so we're entering the quick fire round.
Sure.
So a couple of short questions, 20 to 30 seconds each. Are you ready?
Sure.
Awesome. So the first question is, what's your go-to podcast or book to learn about cybersecurity trends?
Look, for me, to be honest, I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. So I find that on LinkedIn, you see a lot of connections, a lot of things that I'm in a lot of cybersecurity groups. So from there, I'm getting hooked into things all the time. So there's a lot of stuff that I get through LinkedIn as a kind of an aggregator, if I could put it that way.
It is definitely a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Well, what's the most surprising thing for you when you first moved to Singapore?
That's a good question. I think the heat, because when I say the heat, like when you read how hot it is all the time, you kind of think, well, it's 32 degrees. I've been in 32 degrees in France and other places where I've lived, and that's been fine, But I think it's the heat plus humidity. I think that's what gets people. So it might say 32 degrees, but it actually feels like 42 degrees or more, sometimes if the humidity is high. So I think that's the big thing.
Definitely deceiving.
Yes.
All right. Mac or Windows?
I'm a Mac person. I use Windows all the time. I just find that Mac provides a lot more of my creative side. There's apps and tools and things I can use on there that aren't accessible on Windows. I just have a love for Mac.
Nice. And what's the one advice you'd give to aspiring cybersecurity professionals out there?
Well, I'd say curiosity. So don't get too focused in on, don't go in the rabbit hole of just technology, right? Think about it in terms of, what industry would you like to be involved in? Because the one beautiful thing about cybersecurity is that when you're working in a business in cyber, you get to learn everything about the business. Because, as we said earlier, it's all pervasive. This of cyber, the use of technology runs through every part of a business. So, your CISO, as I said, should be one of your business leaders. They need to understand your business, what your strategic goals are, et cetera, and how you want to go about it. So I think that curiosity and that willingness to learn is absolutely essential. If you're coming in as a CISO thinking, I'm only going to be good at cyber, I think you're not really delivering what a CISO should be delivering to the business.
Yeah, I'm an absolute geek for fun facts. Tell me one fun fact about anything.
Fun fact about anything. Fun fact, what about me or about anything else? So,
anything you want.
So fun fact is, although I present as Irish, I'm actually half Swedish, and I was born in Australia.
Oh wow! Okay.
So I'm quite an international person, you know. So these are things that people, you know, assume about me, that, you know, Kevin O'Leary, that's going to be an Irishman, you know. So I think for me, the important point about that is, you know, don't make assumptions based on you know, how somebody presents themselves. There's often a lot more going on behind the scenes.
I was going to ask you what's the one favorite Irish dish that everyone should try, but maybe now I should ask about Swedish or Australian.
Well, no, I mean, let's stick to Ireland. As I said, I'm 50% Swedish, but 100% Irish is the best way to put it. So there's many dishes that are kind of forgotten about in Ireland, I would say. I mean, Ireland was seen for many years as being a kind of a culinary wasteland, to be perfectly honest, right? And there's many reasons behind that, which I won't go into, but I think that over the last 20 years, 25 years, the quality of food and you know, you can go to any pub in any place in Ireland and get a magnificent meal, right? Mainly because the produce is so good, you know, the meat is so good and vegetables are so good, everything's so fresh, and everything is, you know, there's a very little mass produced in Ireland. You know, a lot of it is done through local farms, etc. So that's why, you know, most of the food is so delicious when you're there. But I think, look, classic Irish stew. I mean, if you haven't had a good, proper Irish stew, then you haven't lived.
I would absolutely try that the next time in Ireland. Kevin, thank you so much for being on the Be Fearless podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you.